2 years ago, amidst a continent marked by exploitation and dependence, the young president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, made an almost prophetic promise: factories will rise on our land. To many, it sounded like a distant dream. Today, that dream is beginning to materialize. First, we saw the tomato factory born. Now, the country celebrates something even more symbolic: the first gold bars produced on Burkina soil itself. This is no ordinary story. It is the account of a people who, after centuries of submission, are deciding to take back what belongs to them. Just like in the ancient biblical accounts, where small nations faced empires with only the strength of faith, we see Burkina Faso rising up against colonial structures that seemed unbreakable. The question that hangs in the air is inevitable. Is this small Sahel nation paving the way for a new era of African sovereignty? Or are we simply witnessing an isolated moment that won't withstand external pressures? If you believe that the awakening of Africa has already begun, subscribe to the channel and follow this story to the very end. On January 23, 2024, in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, a historic milestone was celebrated. President Ibrahim Traoré inaugurated the first national mining waste treatment unit, located in the Koto Industrial Zone. Unlike what happened before, when tons of residue were simply abandoned or shipped abroad, the country decided to transform what looked like trash into treasure. The company Golden Hand SA, operating in partnership with the state, was responsible for the project. The agreement defined a 40% stake for the government and 60% for the company, ensuring that strategic control remained in Burkina hands. A few weeks later, the news traveled the world. The initial processing of 142 tons of tailings yielded 44 bars of gold, with a total weight of 93.197 kilograms. These bars were officially delivered to the Ministry of Economy in a ceremony that brought together political and military leaders. More than numbers, this act carried a profound meaning. Each bar, stamped with the official seal of Burkina Faso, represented not just material wealth, but also the conquest of sovereignty. It was as if the country was telling the world, we no longer need others to decide for us. We are capable of creating, producing, and keeping the fruit of our land. The government has already announced plans to process another 298 tons of residue later in 2024. If fulfilled, this will consolidate the formation of national gold reserves, strengthening the country's position against outside pressures. But this was only the first step on a much more complex and challenging journey. The real turning point happened a few weeks after the announcement of the first gold bars. In February 2024, the Burkina Faso government surprised the sector by suspending all export licenses for artisanal and semi-mechanized gold. The news was confirmed by the Reuters agency. The objective was clear: to end the smuggling that financed terrorist groups, organize the sector, and ensure that the wealth remained in the country. This radical measure echoed like thunder. For decades, the majority of Burkina gold left unregistered, passing through the hands of foreign intermediaries. Traoré decided to break this cycle, even knowing the risks of retaliation. For many peasants and artisanal miners, the decision created immediate uncertainties. But the government guaranteed compensation through SONAP, the National Precious Substances Company. Almost simultaneously, another bold decision was made: the nationalization of the Bungu and Wagnian mines, until then controlled by foreign companies. Suddenly, Burkina Faso, considered fragile in international analyses, proved itself capable of challenging powerful multinationals. It is at this point that the narrative gains epic force. Like the biblical accounts when David faced Goliath, a small country dared to rise up against corporate giants. This scene captured the imagination of many Africans who saw in Traoré not just a ruler, but a symbol of resistance and renewal. Parallel to the restriction and nationalization measures, another front was opened the construction of the first gold refinery on Burkina Faso soil. In November 2023, construction began, with the forecast of producing up to 400 kilos of gold per day. According to regional press, the project could create around 100 direct jobs and more than 5,000 indirect jobs. More than an industrial facility, the refinery is a promise of independence. Traore was emphatic during the launch. "We will no longer take our gold to be refined abroad. We will refine it here because we know the true value of what we produce." This statement resonated as a call for national dignity. Every gram refined within the country is also an affirmation of sovereignty. The international reaction was not long in coming. French newspapers classified the measures as resource nationalism and warned of France's loss of influence in the Sahel. In various African countries, especially Mali and Niger, the inspiration was immediate. Local leaders began to discuss joint alternatives, including the creation of a new regional currency to replace the CFA franc. The climate in Burkina Faso was one of fervor. For some, hope and pride; for others, fear of isolation. But the message had been sent: the country would not back down. The moment was compared to a journey through the desert, full of risks, but guided by the conviction that freedom lay on the other side. The civilian consequences of Ibrahim Traoré's decisions began to appear almost immediately. For many, Burkina Faso seeing the first gold bars with the national seal was not just an economic data point but a renewal of collective pride. In distant villages where artisanal mining had always been linked to misery and insecurity, the discourse changed. Now it was believed that gold could serve the people, and not just foreigners. The government announced that part of the sector's revenues would be channeled into infrastructure roads, rural electrification, water supply, and investment in agriculture. This promise raised expectations. In community meetings, local leaders repeated the message that the wealth of the subsoil must bring bread to the table. The vision of a more stable future encouraged families who for years had lived with the fear of attacks and the precariousness of basic services. However, it was not just about hope. The reorganization of the sector also meant that thousands of artisanal miners would need to adapt to new rules. Some feared losing their immediate livelihood. The government, aware of this, created integration programs to transform informal miners into registered cooperatives, offering training and alternatives. It was a slow process, but it reflected the search for order amidst the inherited chaos. In the political arena, the measures completely transformed the image of Burkina Faso. Previously seen as a peripheral and unstable country, it was now noticed as a protagonist in a continental movement. In the corridors of the African Union, delegates began to mention the Burkina Faso example as an inspiration for other countries still heavily dependent on the CFA franc. Internally, Traoré consolidated his position. For a population tired of decades of external tutelage, seeing a young captain confront foreign corporations and governments reinforced the perception of firm leadership. This political capital, however, also brought risks. The more radical the rupture with traditional structures, the greater the possibility of external pressures and even veiled sanctions. There was also the security challenge. By cutting off the flow of illegal gold that financed terrorist groups, the government touched powerful interests. The army had to intensify operations in regions like the Djibo Belt, where extremists still controlled mining areas. Every military victory was celebrated, but the human cost remained high. Despite the uncertainties, the dominant narrative was one of rebirth. As in the biblical Exodus, the people were crossing an arduous desert toward a promised land of dignity and sovereignty. For many citizens, the present sacrifice was worth the hope of a future in which Burkina Faso would no longer be remembered only for poverty, but would be recognized for the courage of its people. While in Burkina Faso, the images of the gold bars awakened pride outside the country, The reactions were mixed. In France, former colonial analysts classified Traoré's policy as exacerbated nationalism and warned of the risk of economic isolation. European newspapers insisted that such measures could deter foreign investors and compromise the financial stability of the region. For them, treating mining waste and building a national refinery was not enough to sustain a modern economy. However, in other parts of Africa, the tone was different. In Bamako, Niamey, and even Dakar, voices began to echo: if Burkina Faso managed to take this step, why not us? The suspension of rough gold exports, confirmed by Reuters, was seen as a gesture of courage, breaking decades of dependence on externally controlled chains. This gesture fueled the debate about creating a regional alternative currency to the CFA franc, an idea that had seemed distant, but which, in light of the changes in the Sahel, was gaining strength. It was as if the small nation had lit a flame, forcing the entire continent to reflect. Suddenly, Burkina Faso's gold was no longer just a precious metal. It transformed into a political symbol. Beyond politics and economics, there was also a moral dimension. In several churches in the country, pastors and religious leaders referenced Traoré's decisions as a sign of liberation, comparing him to Moses, leading his people through the desert. This spiritual interpretation reinforced the popular conviction that the fight for sovereignty was not just an economic project, but an almost sacred mission. In international forums, however, skepticism prevailed. Multilateral organizations recalled that Burkina Faso still faced high poverty rates, lack of infrastructure, and a persistent terrorist threat. The challenge of transforming gold into well-being for all was immense. But it was precisely this contrast that made the narrative more powerful. A small country considered fragile daring to defy the logic established by the major powers. With every new decision by Traoré, the feeling grew that the geopolitical balance in the Sahel was shifting. And even if the international community avoided public acknowledgement, there was an undeniable fact: Burkina Faso was no longer seen as a passive spectator. Now, the country occupied the center of the discussion about the future of Africa. The most surprising turning point was not just the production of the gold bars, but the creation of the National Treasury Deposit Bank. For the first time, Burkina Faso stopped depending on the BCEAO, an institution viewed as an extension of France, to guard its reserves. With this gesture, the country broke one of the strongest links in the neo-colonial system. Now, financial transactions could be made internally without external authorization. For many analysts, this step had a symbolic value, as great as the gold bars themselves. It meant that the nation's financial heart was finally beating within its borders. This move changed the perception of the balance of power. If before Burkina Faso was just another peripheral exporter, now it emerged as a model of self-determination. The combination of physical gold stored on national territory and an independent treasury bank transformed Traoré into a continental reference. The message was clear: we do not ask permission to be free. Just as in the biblical stories when faith led entire peoples to liberation, Burkina Faso's gesture became an inspiration. It was not just about economics, but about identity. The small nation began to write its name among those who dare to change the course of history. Burkina Faso, so often remembered only for poverty and instability, is beginning to be seen in a new light. The streets of Ouagadougou no longer speak only of difficulties, but of a people who believe in the strength of their own hands. Every gold bar produced on national soil is also a bar raised in the edifice of sovereignty. Every decision by Ibrahim Traoré reinforces the idea that freedom is not begged, for it is conquered. The prospects are challenging, it is true. Poverty still exists, external threats remain, and the path is arduous. But hope is being reborn. Like the biblical promise of a fertile land after the desert, the Burkina Faso people are beginning to believe that better days are ahead. And when Traoré declares, "We do not ask permission to be free. We rise up to conquer it," he does not speak only for Burkina Faso. He speaks for all of Africa that dreams of dignity. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. Subscribe to continue this journey of an Africa that no longer kneels. God bless Africa.